Hi everyone, and welcome back to Coachy TV. This video is going to be a little bit different than ones we've done before. I'm basically going to go through and summarize some of the paces we've talked about in previous videos in detail on paces for aerobic type workouts. So if you are listening to this and you haven't watched the full breakdown of each of these workout pace types, like why you would do them, how you execute them fully, all of them are in the description down below if you want to look at them after or before or whatever. This is kind of summarize some of these things all in one area. If you're like, oh, what is aerobic power? What is aerobic threshold? And also a couple different videos that I've done way back that are not as specific to cross-country 5K, marathon pace workouts, critical velocity pace workouts, to kind of put everything in one place if you're looking for just a summary of aerobic pace workout, essentially. So we're looking through, there's basically 5 main paces that we're going to break down here that would be included in aerobic pace type workouts. There's obviously other paces you can do, but 5 main things you would do for actual training purposes from different aerobic and say endurance races, your distance or your middle distance races. There's 5 main different areas you would want to actually be training at. We'll break those down here in terms of summarizing those 5 main types. So basically the 2 key things we're going to be looking at is what's the range for each workout pace, percentage based on an area, and we're going to look at that here early on, and what's the workout extent for each one. So if you're going to be doing, say, an aerobic power workout, I already mentioned that one, what's the total volume you might do if that was broken up into intervals, what that might be. So basically what's the intensity and what's the extent or distance that you would do for each of those we'll summarize here today. Right here, there's a picture of members of our Wharton Endurance Group. So this is distance and middle distance runners here. After our long run for the week in 2018, there's 1 long run per week. If you haven't watched our video, I find the long run to be either the most important workout in getting ready for the cross-country season, and probably the second most important workout in getting ready for the track season for your endurance type runner. So 1 per week. If you didn't see that video, it's in the description down below looking at long runs. And we'll see where the long run breaks down when we talk about aerobic pace workouts here in a few minutes. I'm Kyle Giacono. I'm the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at some of my credentials, they are on the screen. Okay, so just to kind of break down what makes an aerobic pace workout, or how some of the energy is produced in any aerobic pace workout, there's 3 main ways your body recharges ATP. We've got the anaerobic alactic system. I've got a video in the description down below that breaks that down a little bit. The anaerobic glycolytic system, the one that produces acid that you want to work on later on in the season, and we haven't really focused on that. And then there's the aerobic energy system, which has to do with the little guy up on the top here, the mitochondria, which kind of looks like basically like a kidney bean or something like that. And we're really going to focus on the electric transport train. So I really want to talk a little bit briefly here about where most of the energy is coming from, so you can kind of have a sense for why this is so good at producing energy over a long period of time, but when you're asking for it to be delivering energy in a very short period of time, why it can't do that, why it's very efficient but more slow moving. So you might have a better idea of what's going on in your cells when you're trying to ask for it to do anything aerobically, and why the body can't supply all the energy with just this energy system. So aerobic energy production, mitochondria, and the electron transport chain. Here's what I want you to think about is here's the big picture. You've got so many of these in each of your working cells. They produce the energy aerobically. I guess you could think about it as your money in terms of distance races. And the electron transport chain, basically you've got this outer membrane and this inner membrane. Think of this darker color here as the outer membrane, and this darker brown as the inner membrane. So this is kind of that area in and around the outside of the mitochondria, this electron transport chain that we're going to talk about here. So this is the bigger picture. This is kind of this area right in here where these 2 outer membranes and inner membranes kind of happen, and we're going to see what happens in terms of this electron transport chain that allows us to produce ATP, or energy. So first thing, aerobic energy production takes place inside the mitochondria, and there's 2 main ways that it happens, okay? It takes place inside the mitochondria in the cells of the working muscles with oxygen. Aerobic energy is produced with oxygen. Makes perfect sense. And actually the oxygen, it's this right here, and I'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. Okay, So most of the energy, like I said, it takes place in two different areas. Most of the energy is produced in the electron transport chain, I'll shorten that as ETC, in the mitochondrial membrane, as I just said. This outer part, this chain that is transporting electrons inside and outside the mitochondria through this area and around these two membranes. Okay, so to break this down in very, very simple terms, and I will say there's some really cool videos on YouTube that really show this in animation, and I just want to kind of briefly touch on this again so you can see how complex this actually is and why it's really amazing at producing a lot of energy that takes a while. So essentially, hydrogen ions, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Your body is constantly making these. These are what make your body more acidic. Basically, you have these hydrogen protons, okay, the H plus ions. They pass through the outer layer of the membrane. These little yellow dots symbolize those hydrogen protons, okay? So they're going into this chain, going into it, and they're kind of floating in here, and these are the protons. They're going in, they're going in, they're going in, they're going in to this chain through, consider these three little arrows, the three going in and the one going out. These are pumps that are the transportation of the electrons and also the protons. So you've got going into the first three pumps, these hydrogen protons, okay? And then the electrons, so they go in, and the protons go into this, in between these two areas of the membranes. And then the electrons basically stay in this little area, that kind of looks like, for lack of a better term, kind of like electricity. It's kind of this up and down, sort of like pulsating. The electrons kind of transport down this chain, okay? So they go through the first three, and then when the hydrogen electrons are transported through the first three pumps, so 1, 2, and 3, they go in, they're pulling in these hydrogen protons, and the electrons stay here, and they go through the first three. When it gets to the third one, oxygen is sitting right in here, and it accepts the electron near the end of the chain, and that produces water. So basically, the electrons go through the first three, oxygen is sitting right here, and only if oxygen is sitting here will this happen, right? So it produces the energy that way. So it goes through the first three. If there's oxygen present, boom, the oxygen accepts the electron, and the waste product essentially is water, which is very easy for your body to deal with. So that's part of what's going on here. Okay, that's the electron part of it. This last pump, which goes outward, the last pump fires the hydrogen protons that were sitting here bouncing in and around here. The oxygen accepts the electron, which produces energy, goes through here. It allows this last pump to shoot one of these protons out, this last pump. And essentially what that does, the last pump fires the hydrogen ions out at very, very quickly, and the resulting energy of this happening recharges ADP into ATP. This is the term you probably think of the most. This is what all your muscles use for producing energy. The T stands for triphosphate. I really break this down in detail in the video on alactic energy production in the description down below. ADP means there's only two phosphates, and the energy that's producing here allows it to recharge the ADP with two phosphates into ATP, which has three phosphates. And your body basically makes energy by splitting off the last phosphate. So what happens is, again, just to kind of summarize it, it takes in the protons, which float through here. The electrons bounce in through these first three pumps. Oxygen accepts the electron, producing water, and that helps make energy to shoot out the last pump, the proton, which then recharges ADP into ATP. So that's where most of the energy production is happening in the mitochondria for aerobic respiration. When this happens, when that last pump shoots out the proton, the releasing energy creates ATP, or recharges the ADP into ATP. 34 molecules of ATP are produced, or recharged, for lack of a better term, via this electron transport chain. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here, right? We've got these three pumps moving protons in, the electrons transport through it, the oxygen accepts it, makes water, and then the last pump fires through. This is why, as you can see, so much is going on here inside the membranes of this mitochondria that this takes a minute. But that's a lot. I mean, 34 molecules of ATP is a lot, okay? There's also going on in the membrane, this inner part of the mitochondria, there's something that is called, there's two ATP molecules that are going to be produced using the Krebs cycle. It's not as efficient, but basically, when your body is using a molecule of glucose or fat, it's doing one rotation of the Krebs cycle and one pass-through of the electron transport chain. So when you have this extra two ATP molecules that are produced with the Krebs cycle in the inner membrane inside the mitochondria's matrix, that's where the CO2 is produced. So you kind of you always think that there's CO2 that's used with the waste products are CO2 and water with aerobic respiration. This is where it comes from. The water comes from the electron transport chain. The CO2 is coming from the Krebs cycle in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So those are two easily dealt with waste products. The water is either used around the body or it's breathed out along with the CO2. So that's producing a lot of ATP. So when you add that, in the end, we've got 36 molecules of ATP, 34 from the electron transport chain, and 2 from the Krebs cycle, are made using 1 molecule of fuel, either carbohydrates or fat, depending on the intensity, via aerobic respiration. So these two things together, the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, aerobic respiration, we get 36 ATP for 1 molecule of fuel, again, either carbohydrate or fat. That's very efficient, but that was a lot that I just kind of told you, and again, with all that's going on in the electron transport chain, moving in with the Krebs cycle, as you can see, there's a lot going on here, but there's also a lot produced here. So think of it that way. All those things are happening in all your working muscles with the ETC and the Krebs cycle to produce all that energy, but it takes a minute. So think of it that way, okay? In the correct ratio, so we're going to talk about this in the next area. So this is the hydrogen protons, which fuel most of aerobic respiration, 34 of the 36 ATP molecules that are made. Those are produced with anaerobic energy production, anaerobic glycolytic. So basically, if your body is producing energy anaerobically in ratio, those H+ ions, or protons as we call them in here, are going to be used via the ETC, the electron transport chain, and they won't accumulate out here in the cell. So basically the idea being is if the mitochondria in your aerobic system are developed enough, it's going to be sucking in all these free hydrogen molecules, using them for their own respiration, and these don't get a chance to accumulate at a level where they cause problems, okay? They won't accumulate to reduce the body pH. When pH drops below 7.0, if you remember from your chemistry class, that makes things acidic. That's what can cause problems, okay? So, very, very thumbnail sketch of what is happening in your mitochondria to produce all energy aerobically. Let's take a look at some of the aerobic paces. But I just wanted you to get an idea of what is going on in your body inside the mitochondria to see how complex this is and why it's very efficient, but takes a minute, okay? So let's look at the aerobic paces. Okay, so this is the energy continuum. This is all the workout paces you would work to train yourself. Aerobic, anaerobic glycolytic, anaerobic alactic. Okay, so the screen's going to get much less complex here in a second. This is from the USA Track and Field Distance Curriculum, and it is based on VO2 max, which is right here. It's right in the middle because, again, all the aerobic pace workouts are going to be based on your fastest aerobic pace, which is VO2 max. Anybody who's spent time in the weight room, the idea being of setting up workouts, systematic workouts in a weight room, you would figure out what your maximum lift is and then set them up from there. Same thing with aerobic pace workouts. You figure out what your VO2 max is or your fastest aerobic pace and set things up from there. And I have a video in the description down below that talks about how you can test VO2 max in an actual field without, having to go to a lab or something like that. It might be interesting to take a look at if you haven't watched that one. So I'm going to make the screen a whole lot less complex right here by taking away all the anaerobic pace workouts, because we're not dealing with those in this. I'll do a video that talks about anaerobic pace workout summary, but for right now, we're just dealing with the right-hand side of the screen because that's VO2 max and slower, and that's how we're going to be setting up workouts. So VO2 max is sometimes, you'll hear me also call it, it's correctly called with the workout pace aerobic power. Aerobic power, and we'll talk about where the range of that is, but just so you know, it's very much almost the same thing as VO2 max. It's a little bit bigger range than VO2 max. So that's one of the workout paces we're going to be dealing with here. Critical velocity is the second one, and these are going to go from fastest to slowest on this list. Lactic threshold, marathon pace, and aerobic threshold. Okay, so those are the 5 main aerobic pace workouts that we are dealing with. And the reason why all of these workout paces are considered aerobic is because running anything faster than aerobic power or VO2 max, that can only happen with additional contributions from the anaerobic energy system. So VO2 max is the fastest your aerobic energy system can go. Why is that? That last slide I just showed you, that shows how complex things are with producing energy aerobically with the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle. Because of all of that, there's a limiting factor on how fast your body can produce that energy aerobically. So anything faster than VO2 max, and the energy has to come from the faster to energy producing anaerobic systems, either the alactic or the glycolytic system. So that's what makes these 5 aerobic. Basically, the biggest, I mean, in pretty much any, or most workouts, aerobic system is going to be producing most of the energy anyway. But that's the big thing is VO2 max and slower, anything that's faster than that, and the contributions can only happen from the anaerobic energy system. So that's why anything faster than this is considered anaerobic energy, training, and anything that's at VO2 max and slower is considered aerobic energy. Now, it has nothing to do with producing acid because, as I said in previous videos, all 3 energy systems are turned on at the same time, including the anaerobic glycolytic system. It's not really true to think that they turn on and off. They're always working. Even you just sitting here watching this, you are producing some acid because your body is using the anaerobic glycolytic system. But the idea is that they don't accumulate as much. Now, we'll see that VO2 max and critical velocity, they do, so they're a little bit different. But the idea being is your aerobic system is still kind of king in these workouts. So kind of keep that distinction in your mind. So critical velocity is going to be right here, 92 to 90% essentially your VO2 max, and it's closest associated to your 10K race. So basically, if you run a 10K as fast as you can, you're basically running a critical velocity. Just like VO2 max is basically like running 2 miles as fast as you can. As you can see, 5K is a little bit in the middle, closer to 2-mile pace than 10K pace. Lactic threshold kind of crosses over critical velocity a little bit right here, and you'll see that you'll see that H plus ion, those little yellow dots that we have on the last screen. The reason I made them yellow is because of this. This is the area where your body is going to be producing and clearing those hydrogen ions in unison. So this is a little bit of a difference. The workouts here and slower are going to get a slightly different approach than the ones critical velocity and aerobic power. So that's where they are right there. This is also associated with 15K pace. That's not a race that's run very often, but if you were to run a 15K as fast as you can, it would basically be at your lactic threshold or right around it. Marathon pace right there at 82%, and it's obviously going to be associated with your marathon pace. It's very specific to marathon training, so it doesn't get one of these other cool terms like lactic threshold or critical velocity or aerobic power. It's pretty much just for training the marathon. In the video down below, I talk about why you would do it. Basically, it's about using energy, using fat as a fuel source at faster intensities. Video in the description down below if you want a little more detail on that one. And then we've got aerobic threshold all the way down, the slowest and easiest type pace workouts, where your recovery runs and your long runs are down at 65 to 70%. Okay, so we have a better idea of how the energy is produced in your mitochondria, and we also have an idea of where these kind of fit on the energy continuum. So let's take a look at the actual workout paces, where they should actually fit in, and the extent that you would want to do them. And I'm going to have 2 basic categories based on how your body is producing acid along with them, because that's where the limiting factor is going to make these a little bit different. So the first one, aerobic power, again, you hear me also say VO2 max. It's at 98 to 101% of your VVO2 max, or the velocity at which you reach VO2 max, essentially your 2-mile pace. Again, if you're interested in how to actually set up workouts based on those videos in the description down below on VO2 max testing and VO2 max intervals. VO2 max is 100%. Okay, that's your 2-mile pace. Aerobic power is just a little bit bigger. It's 98 to 101%, and you're basically training that area, or that faster pace of the fastest end of your aerobic energy production. Okay, typically the extent is done as intervals. Okay, 800 to 1600 meters of intervals, and you do them multiple times. That's what an interval is. And you're basically going to do 32 to 9600 meters total. 3200 meters would definitely be for people just starting out. If you have maybe an older middle school kid who's been doing it for a while, these are very hard for middle school type kids to do. Typically what I do with my kids that have been with me for at least a year or so, I like to target right around 6,000 meters. I think that's very appropriate. You start getting out to this, and you have to give a lot more rest and recovery afterwards, so it's not really as worth it. But you could go out to 9,600 meters if you wanted to. It could also be done as repetitions. The difference between these intervals has equal work to time on. Repetitions gives a lot more rest, and typically the total volume is less, but you would also be training aerobic power or VO2 max that way. And this would also potentially be a test run, right? If you did a 3,200 meter test, for VO2 max testing, that's a repetition, even though it's only one off. So typically, the distances are 1,600 to 3,200 meters. So again, a 3,200 meter test is a repetition, with total distance about 3,000 to 4,000 meters total. So if you did 4 times 1,000 at the end, toward the end of the season, which I'll do as we're starting our peaking window, with more time off than you would on intervals, that would technically be a repetition. So these are ways that you would do this with aerobic power. And then you've also got critical velocity. As we said, it's about 92% VVO2 max, or based on that 100% VO2 max. Sometimes it's extended out to like 90 to 92%. Again, this is your 10K pace, so that's why it's set at 92%. And you would typically do these in two different ways. Intervals, again, very similar to like what you would do with aerobic power. You would typically give less time off. But you would typically also do a little bit more, so you wouldn't want to do 2 miles worth of 10K pace. You might go 4,000 for somebody who's getting used to it. You could go out to 10,000 meters. Again, just like this with VO2 max, that would be really asking a lot, but you potentially could. And you can also do them as continuous running, 20 to 40 minutes total. And I think I talked about in video in the description down below about tempo workouts, how these kind of serve potentially as tempo type workouts for those that are really well trained, and how you can even mix this up where you're doing a tempo run and then you maybe mix in maybe 2 miles or so, or 3 miles of critical velocity, and then that's the end of the workout. You could do that too, kind of mixing up paces if you wanted to, but you could do these either as intervals or continuous running. You probably wouldn't do them as repetitions. I mean, if you're doing 10K race, that would be repetition, but you really wouldn't do it for training purposes, really, with critical velocity more than likely. Okay, so these two are in one category because they have a limiting factor that's similar. The limiting factor on those days is going to be the accumulation of acid, those H+ ions. So at this pace, that electron transport chain we talked about earlier on can't clear the acid, okay? It can't use it to produce energy fast enough because the anaerobic system is working faster than the aerobic system can keep up. So the idea being is at aerobic power or 2-mile racing, 5K racing down to 10K racing, you're going to have to stop because the accumulation of acid at some point, because your body just can't clear it as much. Now with intervals and things like that, with rest factors, you can go out past like 3,200 meters if you wanted to and that kind of thing. And you should, depending on the day. But that's why these are one category and why these are done as intervals. Okay, so limiting factor is that hydrogen ion accumulation, or the accumulation of acid. These ones over here are going to be a little bit different. So lactic threshold is going to be run at 85% VVO2 max, okay? And that is going to be, it varies with athlete training, but as you can see, this is significantly slower than 92% and way, way slower than aerobic power. So these are going to be done as continuous runs of 20 to 40 minutes. You could go longer, but just like if you went out to 9,600 meters here, you're going to have to give a lot of recovery and rest. I have a video on rest and recovery for sequencing workouts in the description down below that you might be interested in. I don't even go out to 40 minutes. I go out to maybe 35 minutes with my group with continuous running, but lactic threshold is going to be as a continuous run, no intervals. That's interesting. Marathon pace is at 82%, and again, that's also going to vary with the athlete. And the reason why these aerobic paces can vary with the athlete is the more trained you are, the closer they'll be to 85% for lactic threshold and 82% with marathon pace, and 70% with aerobic threshold. I'll show you in a second. Somebody who's just starting off running their marathon pace will not be 82%. It's going to be much slower, and it's going to be very close to their aerobic threshold. Same thing with lactic threshold. So the more trained somebody is, the closer these numbers are going to bear out, but that's why it says varies with athlete and training. Marathon pace, as I mentioned, 82% VVO2 max. You can do these continuous running out to an hour, okay? So we have less intensity here, so we can do them for longer. And again, continuous running. Again, interesting. We've got no intervals involved here. And then aerobic threshold, typically thought of as your recovery and long runs, 65 to 70%. Really, it's more like 70% with your more trained people. With your less trained, you get that bigger range, again, varying with the athlete. VVO2 max. Continuous running out to 2 hours because it's so much less intense. Okay, so there's a big difference here. Those limiting ones that are based on accumulation of acid is the limiting factor for aerobic power and critical velocity. Those have intervals potentially being mixed in with the workouts. And all these over to the right were all as continuous runs. And the reason is the limiting factor on these days is going to be overall fitness. As I said, the more you've run, the more infrastructure. Basically, we've talked about central VO2 max on this channel in the past. But that's the limiting factor here, your overall fitness in that respect. Also, there's central nervous system fatigue because you have so many steps, so many contacts that fatigues your central nervous system. And especially with lactic threshold and potentially with marathon pace, fuel can be the limiting factor. It's not the acid that makes you stop. So that's why these ones have to be broken up more, because you can't go longer than 3,200 meters with aerobic power continuously, because that's the test for it. You just can't do it. And critical velocity, you could do, like I said, a repetition out to 10K if you absolutely wanted to, but you're going to have that idea of the limiting factor being the acid accumulation. So that's why there's this kind of split down the middle with these two. These are your aerobic pace workouts, and why these more intense ones are split up as intervals or potentially repetitions, and these ones are all at continuous runs. Basically, critical velocity kind of goes in between, and you would only do this with like a high schooler who's very, very well developed. In critical velocity, the 10K race is what college men do, so they're obviously going to be very much in shape aerobically. They're going to have more time running. They're going to be just have all the infrastructures in place that you would want in order for aerobic work to actually be as much as it can. So that's sort of the whole split point here with these two. So those are the workout paces. Those are the extents that you would deal with here. Again, we're dealing more with time in these ones, and we are actually dealing sort of with purely the distance on these, just because it's more broken up. So that's kind of the difference between those two main types of aerobic type workouts and the extent that you would do them with. So wrapping up this video, summarizing aerobic paces for your various workouts, some of the key points dealing with here. Aerobic respiration is the most efficient way the body makes ATP, as we said, produced mostly via the electron transport chain, which makes 34 ATP molecules. And when you combine that with the Krebs cycle, we get 36 ATP made using one molecule of fuel, either fat or carbohydrate. So, as we said in the very beginning here, this is very, very efficient, but very, it takes a long time to get those full 36 molecules of, and I abbreviated molecules there as moles, that's not technically the right term, but 36 molecules of ATP with this. And again, I hope that you got a kind of a better idea of, wow, that does produce a lot of energy, but why the limiting factor with aerobic workouts basically is the intensity, because you got to let that electron transport chain in the Krebs cycle play out before you can get this energy. There are 5 main paces used to train the aerobic system. Again, there's other things going on there. There's like the 5K race doesn't have its own specific workout type. You would do a variation of other things going on here. You could say there's other ones in there, I'm sure, that are specific to various types of races, maybe like ultra marathon and things like that. But there's 5 and you would obviously there's other percentages in there that we didn't even deal with. But there's 5 main paces you would use to actually train the aerobic system, not just to go out and be a fun runner or something like that. Aerobic power VO2 max is the fastest, and aerobic threshold easy pace type workouts is the slowest. Some of these create acid accumulation, so the increased intensity of aerobic power / VO2 max and critical velocity runs require increased energy demand, producing more acid, just because, again, as we said up at the top, aerobic respiration just can't supply as much of the, it can supply the energy, but not fast enough to clear the acid using those hydrogen ions in the electron transport chain. This means these workouts are shorter in terms of total volume and usually done broken up. So whereas you can run for 2 hours at aerobic threshold continuously, I wouldn't really recommend that, especially for a high school kid, but you could. We're limited to, 3,200 meters continuous with, say, aerobic power. Or you can do more total volume, but you could do it, you'd have to break it up total. So they can be shorter with the actual training of that energy system and usually done broken up. I think the sweet spot for VO2 max for a high school kid is 4 miles, 6,400 meters. I don't do critical velocity workouts because I don't think it's really specific to cross-country training for most kids, but I have one kid who is really advanced who I think this can help them in terms of their running economy and that kind of thing. But if you're obviously a college athlete or coach, or if you are, like I said, a really, really advanced high school kid, this is an important workout that you could actually mix in there also. But that's what makes these higher intensity, is that the acid is going to be accumulating in the actual workout. And then we've got some of these that create very easy to deal with waste products. We said if you're just dealing with the electron transport chain, it actually will produce water as a waste product. Very easy for your body to deal with that. And then you add in the Krebs cycle along with it, and it produces CO2. Very easy to deal with that. So the reduced intensity of lactic threshold, marathon pace, and aerobic threshold workouts allow for acid to be cleared as it is produced, because aerobic respiration can keep up. The resulting waste products are water and CO2. Your body can easily deal with both of these. This means these workouts are longer and usually done continuously. There might be a reason why you might do lactic threshold broken up into very short intervals. especially if you're dealing with maybe more middle school age kids. And if you do want to do some critical velocity type stuff, broken up as intervals, obviously you can do that with a very short rest up in here. But these ones, usually lactic threshold, marathon pace, aerobic threshold, especially for people that have been training for a little bit, you're going to want to do those continuously. That doesn't mean you don't take a 30-minute break to get water, 30-second break, not 30 minutes, 30-second break to get water or something like that at a water station. That's perfectly fine. But the nature of these workouts are continuous, whereas the nature of these ones that the acid accumulates at aerobic pace, the nature of them is typically to be broken up so you can get more total volume on those days. So I hope you enjoyed this video sort of summarizing aerobic pace, aerobic workout paces, and kind of touching on why the aerobic energy system is so interesting, so complex, so efficient, but also much slower than some other ways of producing energy. And maybe you have a better idea in your mind of why that happens, and hopefully you have a better idea in your mind of where these workouts kind of can be in terms of training somebody for whatever your endurance race is. If you like this video, please, I would really encourage you to hit that like button. If you are finding these videos interesting and useful, please hit that subscribe button. It really does help the channel expand and grow. It allows other people to have it appear in their feed, or if they're searching for things, just kind of helps the channel in that respect to get seen by more people. So I really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button. I do about 3 to 5 videos a week on different aspects of running. Right now I'm focusing obviously on endurance because most people are getting ready for a cross-country season, but in the track season we also focus on other areas, other event types going on too. So if you're interested in that, if you're a running nerd or track and field nerd, you may find that interesting. So hit that subscribe button, maybe share it around with some other people that might find it useful. And I'm going to look at maybe doing a video on different muscle fiber types before I then move into looking at specific prep training. So if you've seen, I did a whole video series on general preparation for cross country, the workout types you would do, how you'd plan it out, breaking down different things like rest and strength work you would do in this. After I do maybe 1 or 2 other side videos, I will look at doing some specific prep type training, and after I kind of show you how to set that up in your training year, the first one we'll look at is medium hills, which actually starts at the tail end of general prep and then goes into specific prep. So until next time, this has been Coachy TV.